The SEAL Admiral mockingly asked the janitor what his code name was, until Lone Eagle's calm reply made him freeze. "So, warrior, what's your military code name?" Admiral Grant Marshall's voice echoed through the Coronado Naval Base cafeteria, dripping with sarcasm as he pointed at the man in the janitor's uniform, cleaning nearby tables. James Washington stopped wiping and slowly looked up. The entire cafeteria turned to watch. Officers paused mid-bite, soldiers fell silent, all waiting for the humiliation the Admiral clearly intended. "Let me guess," Marshall continued, grinning. "Corporal Broom? Sergeant Mop?" Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and cruel. James had never imagined that after years of serving with honor, he would end up mocked in the same hallways he once commanded. After losing his wife in an accident and being left to raise his daughter alone, he had taken the only job available on base, one that made him invisible to the men who once saluted him. Marshall leaned closer, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Come on, buddy. You never really served. You're just here for an easy paycheck." The medals on his chest gleamed under the harsh cafeteria lights like symbols of arrogance. For months, James had endured the sneers, the whispers, and the petty disrespect. He had chosen silence, but Marshall's cruelty cut deeper, reopening an old wound he had long buried. "My code name," James said quietly, his voice slicing through the air, "was Lone Eagle." A heavy silence fell. Forks froze midair. A young soldier gasped. He had heard stories about a ghost-like operator who completed impossible rescue missions alone. Marshall's smile vanished. His eyes darted in disbelief. Because Lone Eagle wasn't a nickname. He was a legend, a myth whispered in classified circles about a man who went where no one else dared and returned with the lost. James stood firm, his calm composure shattering the room's cruel amusement. For 2 years, he had hidden his identity to protect his daughter and their peace. But as he watched Marshall's arrogance turn to confusion, he knew everything had changed. Before all those who had judged him, James stood tall, a quiet guardian of a secret too powerful to reveal until the right moment. If this story of strength and dignity moved you, stay tuned to see how one moment of mockery became the spark for a transformation no one would ever forget. Utter contempt. Lone Eagle. Marshall forced a laugh, scanning the room to ensure all eyes were on him. "Really? You think anyone here will believe that ridiculous story?" His tone was dripping with arrogance, each word heavy with cruelty. A janitor pretending to be a war legend. "What's next? Gonna tell me you're the president's cousin?" James didn't move, but something in his eyes shifted. A coldness that made a few seasoned soldiers straighten in their seats. They recognized that look. It was the same one they'd seen in the mirror after missions that left scars too deep to discuss. "Look at you," Marshall sneered, circling James like a predator savoring its prey. "Worn-out uniform, scuffed shoes, calloused hands. Lone Eagle." He dragged out the words with deliberate mockery. "The only thing you're flying is a broom." The laughter erupted again, louder now, fueled by the Admiral's approval. Every laugh was another brick in the wall of humiliation, being built around James. But what Marshall didn't know was that each insult was being carefully stored away in the mind of a man who had spent years turning information into strategy. Weeks earlier, James had begun to notice a pattern. Marshall's cruelty wasn't random. It was systematic. The Admiral thrived on breaking those he deemed beneath him. James had seen it all, the racist jokes, the verbal abuse toward civilian staff, the intimidation of young soldiers. He remembered when Marshall had publicly reduced a young Hispanic recruit to tears, and when he'd punished a black soldier with degrading chores for an offense that never happened. Each event was cataloged in James's mind with the precision of an intelligence officer, because that's exactly what he had been before becoming Lone Eagle. Marshall leaned closer, voice dropping into a venomous whisper that still carried through the cafeteria. "You made up that little fantasy to impress your kid, didn't you? What will she think when she finds out her daddy's just a liar?" That was his mistake, mentioning Zoe. James's wife, Rebecca, had died 2 years ago in a car crash caused by a drunk driver. She'd been a nurse at the base hospital, and her death had shattered the only world James had known. Since then, Zoe, just 12, was all that mattered. Every long hour, every quiet insult, every ounce of restraint existed to protect her. Lately, Zoe had started to notice the world's cruel edges. She'd asked why classmates teased her about her father's job, why some parents avoided him at school events. James had always answered gently, telling her that all honest work deserves respect. But he could see her confusion and the pain behind her forced smile. "My daughter," James said softly, his voice slicing through the laughter, "knows exactly who I am." Marshall smirked, mistaking calm for surrender. "Of course she does. Her janitor dad who lies to feel important." But others were beginning to see what Marshall didn't. Commander Torres, a battle-tested officer, watched silently, eyes narrowing with recognition. Sergeant Williams, a specialist in covert operations, set down his fork, studying James's controlled breathing, the steady stillness of his hands. That wasn't the posture of a beaten man. It was the quiet readiness of someone who had faced far greater threats and walked away the victor. For 2 years, James had done more than mop floors. He had listened, observed, and gathered intelligence, identifying corruption, tracking favoritism, noting every abuse of power. He had recorded it all with the discipline of the operative he once was. Marshall kept his tirade going for another 10 minutes, his words dripping with hatred and ego. He spoke of how people like James should know their place, how leadership was a birthright of the privileged. Every sentence was poison, and every drop was fueling a reckoning that was quietly taking shape behind James Washington's calm, unshakable eyes. What impressed James wasn't Marshall's cruelty. He had faced true monsters on real battlefields, but the man's sheer stupidity. Marshall was so blinded by arrogance that he couldn't read the room. The veteran soldiers frowning, the officers whispering, even the ones who had laughed now looked uneasy at the venom in his words. When the Admiral finally ended his little performance and strutted away with his cronies, still chuckling, James simply returned to work. He gathered his cloth, parked the cleaning cart, and left the cafeteria with his usual quiet dignity. But something inside him had shifted. Marshall had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. He had made it personal, and personal was exactly Lone Eagle's domain. Each insult only tempered the steel within James, feeding a calm resolve built from the very injustice meant to break him. What the Admiral didn't realize was that every sneer, every act of contempt, was laying the groundwork for his own downfall. The man he had mocked so openly possessed the knowledge, resources, and discipline to turn his world into a nightmare. And soon, that nightmare would begin. That evening, James sat at the kitchen table of his small home, helping Zoe with her math homework, though his mind was still replaying every word from the cafeteria. His daughter was focused on her equations, unaware that her father's old laptop was quietly open beside her. "Dad, are you listening?" she asked, frowning. "I've asked you this question 3 times. James blinked, returning to the moment. "Sorry, sweetheart. Show me again." As he patiently guided her through the problem, part of his mind calculated something far more complex. How to expose a corrupt officer without endangering himself or his child. Because James Washington was not just a janitor, and he wasn't only the legend they once called Lone Eagle. Long before the stories, he had been a military intelligence analyst, skilled at mapping corruption networks and uncovering patterns that brought down untouchable figures. That talent, combined with his combat record, had made him indispensable on covert missions. Over his years on base, James had done more than mop floors. He had gathered evidence. Every abuse, every slur, every breach of protocol by Marshall had been quietly documented. He knew of the inflated contracts exchanged for gifts, the soldiers reassigned out of spite, and the crude recordings captured by accident during office cleanings. But evidence alone wasn't enough. James wanted justice so thorough it would end Marshall's career forever. For that, He needed help. The next morning, James headed to the communications center on his break and found Sergeant Carmen Martinez sorting reports. She was one of the few who always greeted him with real respect. "Good morning, Mr. Washington," she said with a smile. "How's Zoe?" "She's fine, Carmen," he replied, lowering his voice. "I need to talk to you. It's important and confidential." The seriousness in his tone made her pause immediately. She had known him for years and had never seen that look in his eyes. In a quiet back room, James laid everything out. The photos, the audio files, the details of Marshall's abuse of power, all of it. Carmen listened, speechless, as the pieces came together. "My God, James, this is huge. Why tell me?" He met her gaze. "Because you have access to the communication systems, and because Marshall made a fatal mistake yesterday." He outlined his plan, not revenge, but precision. Marshall had humiliated him publicly. Now that same arrogance would destroy him. "The Admiral's weakness," James said, "is that he can't resist an audience. The bigger the stage, the more reckless he becomes. And this afternoon, he has that teleconference with the Pentagon." Carmen nodded, already understanding. As communications tech, she would handle the transmission. If Marshall slipped up in front of his superiors, it would be the end. "But how can we be sure he will?" she asked. For the first time in days, James smiled. "Leave that to me." The rest of the morning moved like clockwork. During lunch, James used his janitorial clearance to access Marshall's office and planted a discreet recording device Carmen had provided, perfectly positioned, nearly undetectable. Meanwhile, Carmen prepared the teleconference line, activating a security protocol that automatically recorded all communication during suspicious sessions. At 2:30, as Marshall adjusted his medals and readied for the call, James appeared at the doorway. "Excuse me, Admiral. May I do a quick clean before your meeting?" Marshall didn't even look up. "Be quick. Try not to break anything with those big hands." The insult landed exactly as expected. As James wiped the desk, he listened. The Admiral bragged about officers being put in their place. Then with a smirk, "You know, Washington, that story about Lone Eagle gave me a laugh. I'll share it with the generals today. They'll love it." James stayed calm. "As you wish, Admiral." Marshall chuckled cruelly. "I bet you tell your little girl her dad's a secret war hero." How pathetic. The hidden mic caught every word. Still, James needed more. "Admiral," he asked softly, "do you really believe people like me should never have served?" Marshall leaned back, ready to preach. "It's not personal, it's reality. Some are born to lead, others to serve. That's nature's design." James nodded. "And that applies to all people of my background?" "Statistically speaking," Marshall said, "there are certain limitations. Your daughter should probably aim lower, too." James's jaw tightened, but his tone remained level. "Thank you for your honesty, Admiral." The phone rang. The conference was about to start. James gathered his tools and walked out, pausing just long enough to see Marshall square his shoulders, straighten his medals, and fix the confident mask he always wore for higher ranks. What the Admiral didn't know was that his entire conversation had already been broadcast during the system's sound test, heard by several generals waiting on the line. Carmen, meanwhile, had engaged the official recording protocol, ensuring every word to come would be preserved. As James pushed his cart down the hall, a faint smile crossed his face. Marshall, blinded by ego and thrilled to have an audience, would inevitably go too far. James had learned long ago that the best time to strike wasn't when an enemy was guarded, but when he believed he couldn't lose. And Marshall, certain he was among allies, was about to hang himself with his own arrogance. Down that quiet hallway, James Washington wasn't a janitor anymore, nor a man seeking revenge. He was a strategist executing the final phase of an operation his enemy never saw coming. Because men like Marshall never suspect that the people they look down on might be the most dangerous ones in the room. At exactly 2:45, the conference began. 3 generals from the Pentagon appeared on screen, their uniforms flawless, their expressions severe. Marshall greeted them with practiced confidence, ready to showcase his leadership. "Let's review the evaluations of your officers," one of them said. Marshall leaned back, smiling proudly. "Of course, General. We have a few cases that deserve special attention. What he didn't realize was that the generals had already heard part of his earlier conversation, the comments about genetics and social order. Before he could continue, one of them, General Williams, interrupted, his tone sharp and controlled. "Before we begin, Admiral, I need to ask you about something we just heard."